folks, welcome. It is July the 5th, 2021, and we are here with the Counter Clipping Show. I would like to welcome everybody who is already in the chat. Our topic tonight is something that I have had on the list of things I want to talk about for quite a long time, and I figured this is as fine an opportunity as any, which is the clash between Europa and OCS. Now, I think I will, before we get into the business part of the episode, I think it will be obvious to everyone watching which side of this particular slice of bread I am buttered on. So I am literally sitting here clipping the third winter as we talk. So I am very much on the OCS side of this debate, but I'm not going to also pretend that OCS doesn't have its flaws and idiosyncrasies as well. And we're going to talk about some of those, and we're going to talk about comparison and contrast and why I think OCS does a lot of what Europa does, but generally speaking does it better. So we will get into that. Miscellaneous business. So I have been threatening for several months to do another sale video. That sale video will be live to the public at 9 p.m. on Wednesday evening. That is Wednesday the 7th. It will be live to patrons of Ardwulf's Lair at 5 p.m. on Tuesday the 6th. I have to check the dates here to make sure I don't get them wrong. I'm going to pull it backstage at 5 p.m., do all the adjustments and stuff, and then relaunch it after the stream with Dan, which is on Dan's channel, No Enemies Here, tomorrow at Wednesday at 6:30 Eastern, and then we will go live. I will give you advance notice that there's a bunch of goodies in there, including at least one shrink-wrapped Victory Games title, and it's a good one. It's one of the ones that is both very well regarded and not on any obvious calendar to be reprinted anytime soon, which is a narrowing list, as you're aware. I did have a buddy unboxing of the new NATO, The Cold War Goes Hot, and forgot to hit the record button. So we won't be having an unboxing video of that, at least not this week. There will be an unboxing video on Thursday. So I reconnected with an old buddy of mine in the Cleveland area who I used to do wargaming with back in the 90s. And he got into World War II reenactment, which is both expensive and physically taxing, and I definitely had the impression he wasn't doing much wargaming. I reconnected with him over the last week or so, and his brother, who was also a friend of mine, passed away, and he will be handing a big chunk of his brother's stuff to me to sell for him. That will not be making it into Wednesday's episode. That will instead probably be making it into a future sale wave targeted currently for September. So there will be at least 2 more waves of sales. I have Wednesday's video has a bunch of boxed stuff, some old GMT stuff from various publishers, including one pretty rare publisher, and a whole lot of S&T magazine games, most of which are unpunched. Some of which are old SPI games, and some of which are Decision Games era games. So Great War in the East quad will pop up, but not Wednesday. Sorry. It's the problem with Great War in the East is I've been sitting on it since the last wave, and it's literally buried. I cannot get to it right now. I have to get rid of the stuff that is in Wednesday's wave before I can get to subsequent waves. So it will pop up again, and there is a copy of Great War in the East quad, unpunched no less. It's very nice, to be fair. Let's see how we're doing this. So I have an extra counter tray for Germans right now, and they will be consolidated hopefully tonight. I hope to finish the clipping of Third Winter tonight. So let me say hello, first of all, to Strelnikov, Matt Taylor, Charles Latora, Kaiser Bill, Dale Brady at Beat Cafe. I always read it as Beat Cake. I get the beat, but not the cafe for some reason. Kaiser Bill, Stephen Roberts, Michael Sherman, Jacob Guernsey, Carl Creeder, who is an hour north of San Diego. It's 96 degrees where he is. It's 96 degrees where I am. It is idiotically hot. Bill Simone, Douglas Gearhart, Charles Latour, if I didn't read your name already, Kyle Reese, Alan Salazar, Krusty Captain, Henry Sikorsky, John Longshore, Tom Borman, Jeff Anderson, Stephen Reynolds, if I didn't list your name already, Todd Walser, and we are and Matt Taylor, and we are definitely well represented in Central Ohio tonight. So I got a new pair of tweezers. There are these. You can get these on Amazon. These are the illuminated tweezers manufactured by General. They are. I've used them before, but I never owned a pair. They are very nice. I made some small adjustment with a pair of vice grips so that the tips, I don't know that you'll be able to see this, kind of pinch in, because I hate it when the counter on the bottom is the narrowest counter, because that happens kind of regularly. These things are not die cut to the precision that we would all prefer. I'm getting used to them. They are working well so far. They do have the little flashlight on them. I took that off because it's stupid. So I can envision no scenario in which I think that would be valuable. If I need a flashlight to see the counters, there's not enough light in the room, and I'm going home. Seriously, good lighting is a precondition for me wargaming. I simply will not do it in shabby lighting. I can't. My eyes cannot handle it anymore. I would like to direct everyone to the video description, where there is a channel of the week, the War Room. Please check that out. He is doing content that is worth your time. And we are drinking Ardbeg Wee Beastie with a healthy portion of water. I think I'm only having one tonight because the heat is such that it's dehydrating me, and that's causing migraines, and that's not fun. So we do not wish to do that again. Is it Great War in the East Quad? It's not Great War in the East Quad that I have. I may be able to rustle one up. It is the Army Group South Quad that I have, unpunched. And the condition is, it's really nice. All right. So I had a discussion with my buddy from Cleveland today about Europa, actually, and he related some of his experiences with Europa, which, of course, happened a lot earlier than my experiences with Europa. I didn't do Europa until 2016 or 2017 or something like that. We'll wait on that. But when we did, of course, I had owned a couple of the games back in the day. I think I even had Fire in the East. Okay, so the series dates from a pair of very early GDW releases from 1972 or 1973, called Drang nach Osten and Untenscheiden. And these together cover all of the Eastern Front. And they're split not geographically, but temporally, right? So the Drang nach Osten covered the Eastern Front, I think, up to sometime in 43, and Untenscheiden picked that up sometime in 43 to either late 44 or early 40, or 45, or till the very end, okay? And then at some point, somebody at GDW, and again, the system dates from 1973, and that's going to be an important point that I keep coming back to, because, frankly, it shows. Now, the scale on that is 15 miles to the hex, and the scale is nominally divisional, but in practice there are an enormous quantity of smaller units. Small battalions, small, everything below divisions, all the way down to companies in some cases. But the scale is 15 miles to the hex. The stacking limits... We'll get to the stacking limits after the history section. Okay, so at some point, somebody at GDW got the idea of, hey, we can actually use this system to do the rest of World War II in Europe as well. And then we can put it all together at the end and have sort of a grand Europa type of thing that you can, in principle, play all together. Well, they did a lot. GDW, when we say they, we mean GDW, in at least up to this point. Did a lot of it, but not all of it. There were some pieces that were missing. In particular, the big piece that was missing was what was eventually released by GRD as Second Front, which is the Western Front, starting in 1943. You had the Western Front from France in 1940 in the game The Fall of France, and you had the Battle of Britain in the game Their Finest Hour, which is probably the best title for a Battle of Britain game that is even possible. And in fact, generally the titles were cool. So they eventually redid Drang nach Osten as Fire in the East, and Untenscheiden as Scorched Earth. And then they did an expansion for both games called the Urals, which basically just, I think there was a counter sheet or two in there as well, but mostly it just extended the map out to the Urals, so that you could in principle play the entire Eastern Front, beginning to end, with all three things, okay, no matter where you went with that campaign. And I remember and I had Fire in the East at one point. I had Fire in the East, I had Case White, which was the invasion of Poland, and I had Narvik. And I think that's all I had back in the day. Never played any of them at the time. And dumped them pretty early on, to be fair. We will probably at least mention the total clown show that is Total War, by the way. So, I got about 2/3 of the Germans done here, by the way. So, Jeff Beeler corrects me on the exact timetable. Fire in the East, 41 and 42. Scorched Earth was 43 to the end. I believe that's correct. So, the system was revised somewhat in Fire in the East and Scorched Earth and later volumes in the series. They did 3 games that were set in the Mediterranean theater. Torch, Western Desert, and the Near East. The Near East was kind of like a Middle Eastern expansion pack. There may have been an Operation Exporter thing in there as well, actually, but most of it was parts of the Middle East where not too much action happens. I guess you could make the same statement about Operation Exporter, to be honest. But nevertheless, by the time GDW ended as a thing, they hadn't quite got all the pieces out, much less getting out the final piece, which was going to be Grand Europa. When GDW, or around the time GDW went under anyway, or I should say ceased operations, which is technically accurate, the rights to Europa passed to a company called Games Research and Design. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Games Research and Design's internal operations or structure. What I can tell you is that the main man there was a guy named Winston Hamilton, who was somebody who had worked with GDW prior to that. I think he bought the rights, or he and some other people bought the rights. GRD, as they came to be known, released several games in the series, including 2 that I have today. War in the Desert, which combines the 3 old Mediterranean modules, and I have For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is the Spanish module, and what's the other one I have? Balkan Front, which is the revision of GDW's Marita Mercure. Nevertheless, the system is, it evolves somewhat, especially the naval system evolves, but I mean, it's still very much the same game that was released in 1972 or 1973. And in fact, that's kind of a huge part of the issue that I have with Europa. On the one hand, there are people who like Europa and are super into it, and I have no problem wishing Godspeed to those folks. If that's their bag, cool. Also, I will say that the Eastern Front part of Europa is a thing that is not really possible to experience elsewhere. It's not that different in scale from, say, SPI's War in the East, but it gives you a great deal more, which came out later, by the way, which gives you a great deal. Europa gives you a great deal more detail than than War in the East does. We're going to be confused and stumble over these titles. The Scotch possibly doesn't help. I mean, you're basically looking at like a 6 or 8 map East Front game, right? And there's just not a lot on that scale. And again, War in the East is close, but not quite. So there is an experience to be had in Europa that is difficult, if not actually impossible, to get outside of that experience. That is less true of the other Europa games, right? It is you know, there's a game called The Fall of France, which is the invasion of the Low Countries in France in 1940. There's a number of games that cover that, right? Including a James Dunnigan design, France 1940, including Mark Simonich's France 40, including the OCS title, Blitzkrieg Legend. This is all just off the top of my head, right? So, and those are all at a lower scale than Europa. They're giving you more detail, more epic than Fall of France is. And in fact, compared to the East Front, the West Front stuff, which I have played in Europa, feels quite confined. Because it's the same scale, right? It's 16 miles to the hex. I think that's a huge problem. So the hex scale in Europa is 16 miles to the hex. The turn scale is 2 turns per month, so they're 2 week turns. And the unit scale is basically divisions, but with tons and tons of smaller units. The unit scale of Europa and OCS are basically the same. There's lots of divisions, but there's also lots and lots of smaller units. In particular, things like armored formations and things like that, which I'm actually working on right now, tend to be represented by a number of battalion or regiment or brigade scaled counters, right? That's less true in Europa, but you still have tons and tons and tons of independent armored units and engineers and specialized artillery and commandos and all this stuff. So, I mean, like, the number of pieces is about the same. But then you look at the map scale and the unit scale and think something doesn't make sense here. And if you, like, have seen pictures of Europa, at least, you'll know that it's infamous. People make fun of OCS for having tall stacks, but OCS has got nothing on Europa for tall stacks. If I have a really huge stack in Europa, in OCS, it's way behind the lines, and or that huge stack is mostly air or supply points. In Europa, there is no disincentive to not stack to the stacking limit. On the front line, you absolutely want to stack to the stacking limit. There is no disincentive to do that. The stacking rules in Europa are Baroque. They're not that ornate, but they're pretty Baroque. I mean, they're relatively complicated. From memory, it's been a couple of years. You can stack 3 units in a hex, which may be divisions. You can stack 3 additional regimental equivalents. Now, the regimental equivalent is a thing that is used in OCS 2, and in fact, Dean in the rules credits Europa with the idea. But the determination of what is a regimental equivalent and what is not in OCS is relatively straightforward. If it's a regiment, or if you can't tell what the size of the unit is, it's 1 RE. Or, if it's multiple steps, it's 1 RE per step. Or, if it's smaller than a regiment, like a battalion, then it's either a half or sometimes a quarter of an RE, okay? And then that regimental equivalent does things like affect portage and things like that. In Europa, this can actually vary by nationality. So, and I forget exactly how this breaks down, but the divisions of one nationality can be a different number of REs than units of another nationality, and in no case do they represent steps, except insofar as they can represent individual counters. And then I think you can add 3 artillery units or 3 artillery REs to the stack as well. So how this breaks down, because there are units that are like battalions, that are like half an RE or a quarter of an RE, or companies in some cases. So you can have your 3 extra REs in the hex, but that could be 8 counters. So you can stack roughly 20 land units in a hex. This does not count air. It does not count bases. It does not count supply points, which you do count with counters on the map in Europa. So that's why you see these enormous stacks. In OCS, certainly in any hex that has contact with the enemy, you are massively disincentivized from stacking to the stacking limit, which is 10 REs all the time. That's another thing is stacking limits in Europa vary by terrain. So like mountain hexes, you have a lower stacking limit, or at least a lower limit of things you can attack out of it. I might be misremembering that. So there will be at some point. Let me catch up on the chat here. There will be at some point a copy of Proud Monster for sale. FYI, I believe unpunched. Okay, John Longshore mentions that the original stuff is dear and dear to his heart, and I get that. Like I said, especially the East Front stuff, you really don't get that same experience anywhere else. Even if it is a huge monster experience, and it takes like 2 years to play it. Jeff Beeler mentions that Marina Mercure, which is one of the very small, not that small, but it's small. It's like 2 counter sheets and 1 map, something like that, maybe 2 maps. So it's, as Europa games go, it's pretty small. The smaller ones are pretty manageable. The system is still super clunky. Proud Monster versus the Dark Valley. I have played the Dark Valley. It is very good. I have not played Proud Monster. One criticism of Proud Monster is it doesn't continue to the actual end of the war. It leaves off in like mid 44, which is a very weird choice. Carl Creeder asks about TSWW from Diffraction Entertainment Europa redone. It is kind of Europa re-envisioned. I wouldn't say redone, because it's not just a new Europa. There's a lot of other stuff going on there. But it is certainly a sort of a deconstructed and reconstructed Europa. And there are things about it that I like. I like the maps, for example. And I actually kind of like the counters. They're super thin, but they're attractive and perfectly aligned. And there are some things in the rules that I absolutely fantastically despise. So we may talk about that in a future episode. Jeff mentions that 2 of his favorite Europa non-mainstream games were No Pasaran and Africa Oriental. Africa Oriental actually showed up in an S&T magazine. It would be interesting to see that, actually. So you get like all of East Africa at the Europa scale, which is a bit crazy. John Longshore mentions TSWW's Barbarossa, which is actually a thing, which is hilarious. Wardrobe has mentioning his recent Battle for Normandy. We'll be talking about Normandy games, I think, in a future episode, because I have a lot of Normandy games. I've played a fair amount of Normandy games, and I have a lot to say. And the Battle for Normandy is a good one. It is worth your time. There may be a Battle for Normandy showing up in a future sale as well. It won't be on Wednesday, I'll tell you that. It's not sure how that's going to shake out yet. Let me put it that way. Jeff mentions that the basic unit is a core stack you build from lesser units, sometimes different makeups. So this was definitely the case in Second Front. You were encouraged to keep units on off-map display and use the core markers, but the stacking limit is the same, right? You're just substituting this core marker on the map for the huge stack. We found that at least on our table space, there was no way we could have enough. There weren't enough core markers to contain all that. So we had every core marker in play, and we still had tons of mile-high stacks floating around. And again, remember, we used off-map displays for the air bases as well. So, but you'd still end up with air units on the map because you didn't have enough of those off-map boxes. I picked up a copy of Balkan Front, which is the redone Marina Mercure last year sometime for relative chump change, I think, on BGG. I paid $50, something like that. They're not all super duper valuable. A lot of them are, but not all super duper valuable. And my Balkan Front is in the shrink wrap too. Bit dished, but it's in the shrink wrap. So, Brent, thanks for stopping by. What are 2 game series I've never spent much time with? Well, that's not my fault that you're, an uneducated peasant. They also did, Europa branched into World War I and into the Pacific as well. The Pacific series was called Glory, I think, and I think the World War I one was called the Great War. I could be wrong about both of those things. If you really want the world experience and you want the Pacific stuff, then I do think that the Second World War is probably a better place to go because even though I have objections to some of the rules. So when I clip, I tend to organize as I clip. I haven't always done it that way, but I have done it that way overwhelmingly lately. We have a lot of units here. Ooh, this is a black counter with a dark purple stripe on it. That's going to be hard to see. Okay. Over There is one of the titles, and I think one of those West Front World War One titles actually includes the World War One in East Africa too, or German East Africa, which is interesting. OCS World War One. I want to say that the original pitch for OCS was that it would handle 20th century conflicts, but the fact is that MMP and the gamers before them have done nothing except for World War II and the one Korean War title. So, and I don't mind particularly. In part because I'm not interested enough in the Korean War to have multiple games on the Korean War, right? And I have a couple already, so I'm really covered on that topic. So that's just me. Another thing that we found is that, now again, bear in mind we were playing Second Front, right? The game as we played it began in July of 1943 with the invasion of Sicily more or less on time, and ended, when the game ended, in May of 1945. It took us about a year and a half to play that, okay? The East Front experience may be different, but the amount of time that we ate dealing with the Europa air system was absolutely ridiculous. There are SCS World War I titles, yes. I actually feel like Der Weltkrieg feels to me a lot like OCS, actually. So if you're looking for an OCS-type experience with, frankly, a much more elegant, cleaner system, and you want it to be World War I, then I do recommend a look at Der Weltkrieg, which I recommend anyway. I think it's a good game system. So back to the scale. If you think about frontage, that's where the scale at Europa breaks, right? You have about the same number of units in an OCS game covering the same topic. But you have, well, aside from markers, units you have about the same, roughly the same number, right? The scale is roughly equivalent. But in OCS, you have three times as many hexes to spread those units out in, and you are encouraged to spread them out and not stack them to the stacking limit in every single hex. And of course, the disincentive is that if a hex is overstacked and it is attacked with artillery or any kind of barrage, but especially actual artillery, then it is very likely to take step losses. And if you have 4 REs in a hex, it is overstacked and you are taking a penalty. There are idiosyncrasies, little fiddly bits around that rule, where a single unit never counts as more than 3 REs for the purposes of barraging it. And that does include even like large multi-unit formations. But nevertheless, you're also encouraged to hide stuff. And there's no rule for that in Europa. But most games don't do that, so I don't think that's a serious criticism of Europa. There's also Europa's armor rule, and this is something that was cleaned up a bit in the TSWW series, where you get an armor, and I don't quote me on exactly what the armor bonus is. I think it's a column shift, but I could be misremembering that. But what I do remember is that you get that column shift if 1/7 of your attacking force is armor factors, but like some units count toward the tabulation and some units don't. So artillery, for example, you don't count that. You don't count that as part of the total that you need 1/7 of. It's kind of ludicrous. And I don't see how it works better than to say, if you have any attacking armor, you get a +1 or something like that. I mean, you could structure your CRTs in such a way that happens. Also, like on the attack, it can be very difficult, and I guess this is part of the challenge of playing Europa, to scrape up favorable attacks. You'll, as the allies, for Western allies, for example, you'll be making a lot of attacks in 1944 and 1945 at like negative, and it's a D6 CRT, at like -4 to 6 DRMs. It's crazy. The system is again, it's a early 70s system. It was state of the art when it came out, and it breaks in a lot of places. I know Todd is more familiar with Europa than I am, in fact, so he may be able to offer corrections here. Um, so Operation Michael, Rock of the Marne, and Drive to Paris or Drive on Paris are the three SCS games that are on World War One that I can think of off the top of my head. Panza mentions that Europa has the problem that it has to pretend that it's going to be able to play the whole war in Europe, so it has to have huge hexes to get it. That's true, and yet if you've seen the whole map, and I have, they used to put it on the wall at Europa Fest, you'll know that that is an absolute fantasy. There is no conceivable table in which that is playable in one table. There's no conceivable event unless you have, a community of retired people who literally have nothing else to do except play Europa. That's the only scenario in which you could play a thing with that footprint. The footprint is not just the space that all of Europe takes up. It is the amount of time it takes to play. So we found that, all this said, by the way, it's been a couple years since I've played Europa, and I am feeling like there will be a time when I will play Europa again. Let me put it that way. Possibly not something quite as ambitious or time-consuming as Second Front, but we'll see what happens. The three that I have are For Whom the Bell Tolls, War in the Desert, and Balkan Front. Balkan Front is nice and small, so. Carl Creeder just completed his Der Weltkrieg collection, which is fantastic. Now, I'll also say that I think pretty clearly Europa as a package is the inspiration for Der Weltkrieg, right? Where you have all of World War I in this giant package. And on a map footprint and time footprint that's not really playable at any reasonable event. That said, I am aware of at least one attempt to play the whole thing at a convention. I'm sure they didn't finish. And of course, they broke the map up over multiple tables. And the other difference between Der Weltkrieg and Europa is that Der Weltkrieg finished the job. Europa never did. Now, there's some non-official attempts to do the Master Europa or Grand Europa. Master Europa was its own thing. That's a separate deal. But Grand Europa, which is the rules to unify everything, it's not really unified. So Winston Hamilton passed away, and that was functionally the end of GRD. And Europa passed into the hands of HMG, or Historical Military Simulations, HMS, I forget what the name of the company is. And I believe they did release one or two products, including Wavell's War, which is a redo of, I think, all the Near East stuff, and which is interesting if I'm right about what Wavell's War was about, but also completely redid the naval system. I know Wavell's War has its own naval system. But then they announced that they were going to redo the long-awaited redo of Fire in the East and Scorched Earth in a package called, two-game package called Total War, and I think the second one was going to be Gotterdammerung. They took a bunch of people's money for Total War, produced some of the components, including a full map set, a full counter set. I think the rules might exist and the order of battles are missing. It was never released. They even made boxes. It was very close to being done, and then the company's will to exist appears to have simply disintegrated. I know Wavell's War goes for a giant pile of money. Well, the other thing is that we get an OCS game every year or two. So, the last Europa game to be released, I think, was Wavell's War, and we have seen it's been many years since they took people's money for Total War, and no game is forthcoming. I do know that individuals have offered the principals behind that company giant piles of money to either buy it off them, or if they're just in the hole money-wise, to pay to dig them out of that hole, and they have refused. So I do not, at this point, I think the reasonable thing to expect is that Total War and therefore the Götterdämmerung is in fact not coming out. So if you are a fan of Europa, then maybe it is to your benefit to check out the Second World War stuff from Diffraction Entertainment. There are, like I said, there are things that I strongly dislike about that game system, but I think those things don't actually come into play in the Eastern Front game, so they may not be a consideration for you. So I forget what the thing is called, but there is what I will call, for the purposes of this discussion, a national scaling factor, which is a multiple that you multiply the combat factors of every counter by before you conduct any combat. That is an idiotic mechanic. And if you need that kind of mechanic, then I'm going to say that you are starting from the position of having a game that is busted up front. That is an unreasonable mechanic, I think, to conduct a calculator operation before every combat, before you even get to the factors, let alone the odds, right? All right, Jeff Beeler mentions the Great War series. This is the Europa-esque World War I, which is started by GRD. March to Victory, which is the first half of the West Front, and then the second one is Over There, which is 1917 to 1919, I suppose. And I guess that's the one for Africa and Mexico. Don't know how much you'll get out of Mexico, but this is the Zimmerman telegram scenario. So that's interesting. One of the things, so I don't know that Dean really said this, but I do feel, and I have always felt, I was, by the time I got around to playing Europa, which was that Second Front game that I've just talked about, I had been playing OCS for a little while, and I was struck by the similarities between OCS and Europa. And there's even a few points in the rulebook, the OCS rulebook, where Dean, or whoever was rewriting it at the time, mentions, hey, this idea came from Europa. And talking to other people, I've since learned some things about this is the way couple of these things are in OCS, which are answers to the way those things were handled in Europa. The general lack of engineers, for example, in OCS, and the subsumption of their functions into headquarters, which is honestly something I'm not a huge fan of in OCS, is a result of the way those sometimes got used in Europa, where these valuable engineer units would be sent to plug holes in lines. But the reason why that happened is because they gave you too many of them. That was the problem. You didn't need all those. You could say, headquarters have or cores or whatever have this intrinsic engineering capability, and get rid of hundreds of engineer counters, for example. Now, I do think that Jeff is onto something here when he says that DNO and Untenscheiden had less detail. I do believe significant detail, was added when they were redone as Fire in the East and Second Front. Scorched Earth. Both of which are fairly valuable now, by the way. And hell, if I saw decent condition Fire in the East for a price that I thought was reasonable, which would, for me, be about $50 or less, that's not a target price. That's an unreasonably low price for that. Hell, I would grab it in a heartbeat. I feel fond enough about Europa to say, despite my initial reaction last year when 2 Europa games fell into my hands these are going away, I'm going to unload these, to say, no, I think I'll hang on to these, especially War in the Desert, which looks like it's fairly interesting in its own right. Jeff, that's an interesting sounding scenario. I am not at all sure that Europa is the vehicle that I would want to use to explore that hypothetical situation. I have seen that pop up over there. I've seen that pop up on the Facebook Marketplace several times in the last year. I will tell you that. It's not common, but it's not as hard to find as maybe you'd think. Wavell's War, on the other hand, I have never seen. One of our local guys has it, but I've never seen it. So I showed a picture on Twitter the other day. Might have put it on Facebook too. I don't think I did. Of stuff that's come in over the last week. So I would like to say thanks, Mike, for giving me that or selling me at a great deal that copy of Paulo Mori's Blitzkrieg. That looks super interesting. I found one not quite a Grail game, but a game that I've had my eye on for ages since seeing Stukajo's videos on it is Napoleon Against Europe. Same designer as Nations in Arms and Pitt's War, except it's kind of an intermediate between those two designs. It looks really good. I have wanted a copy for ages, and it was always a situation where either it was an available thing and I didn't have the money, or I had the money and it was not available. And in recent couple years, this is a Hexasim title, by the way, gorgeous game too. As is honestly everything that I've seen from Hexasim. Not quite a Grail game, but a game I've wanted for a long time. I finally found a copy for a price that I considered reasonable. I hadn't seen one for quite a while for less than $200, which is not something I was willing to pay for it. So I have finally scored a copy. It has arrived. It came along with what might end up being this week's unboxing video, which is possibly the last free copy. Not free copy because I paid for it, but the last loose copy of Atlantic Chase. I am just starting to eyeball that now. There's a considerable amount of YouTube video on it. It is very interesting looking. And I expect that it will get fast-tracked for reprint, which probably still means a reprint is at least a year or two away. But it's also supposedly first in a series, so I am quite impressed with, it looks neat. Just the game mechanics look neat. And the development is some of the best development I've ever seen. There's a separate booklet of tutorial scenarios, of staged phased learning scenarios. That is super unusual. And in fairness, maybe it's necessary for that game because it's pretty different mechanically from a lot of war games. So I'm pretty impressed with what I see so far. Hopefully we will start to see some content on it. Another thing that I picked up and which took forever to arrive because it's sat on FedEx's warehouse for however long, was a package containing Gallipoli 1915, Churchill's Greatest Gamble, the Jeffrey Phipps game. I don't know who Mike Phipps might be. And there's a sequel to that, Mons, which is on P500 right now. And the game system has just been sort of revised as well. So that looks very interesting. And the new edition of Flying Colors arrived with it. That is the current printing from, I think, last year that contains the Ship of the Line expansion as well as all the extra scenarios that were in C3I magazine, and I think a couple other new ones as well. So it is a huge, again, a huge value-laden package from GMT. It's good game system. Some people do feel that it's too marker-heavy. Having played more marker-heavy games, its marker heaviness does not bother me particularly. I'll put it that way. Some people won't necessarily like it, or will find it awkward to play for that reason. Jeff says he has Wavell's War in the Ziploc. I assume that is worth big dollars. Mike Iggy Critical asks, when is Hexasim reprinting Austerlitz 1805? I don't know. One of the reasons why I dumped that was because I couldn't get the copy of Waterloo, because they had already printed it twice by then and it was out of print. I'm not convinced they'll ever reprint that again, even though it's sold out already. Mike, I do remember that, Todd. So, I think we're still going here. Yep. Now, I will also offer the disclaimer that even though I find the multiplier a ridiculous mechanic that it results in a hard pass on my part. There are probably folks who will say, hey, tracking supply points on the map with counters and counting and stuff is a hard pass for me. And that's an understandable position to have, I think. And that is, the signature thing of OCS. Dean was asked, there was an article, where was this article? I think in Operations Magazine, where Dean was asked what he felt the central innovations were in his games, and I think his central innovation for OCS was not supply, but the surprise mechanic, which I'm going to say that is a new thing, right? I don't know that I've seen a similar mechanic elsewhere. And it is very, very easy to see that rule and think, well, this is ridiculous. And yet, in actual play, it pretty much works. It's weird, and you think it's going to completely throw the game off, but it actually does work. There are, it creates a different and additional set of considerations on top of just the combat odds. Am I attacking at great odds, but I have a significant -2 to action rating? If so, maybe I want to think twice about that overrun where defender surprises are more likely. Or if I have a big advantage in action rating, maybe I want to do an overrun instead. Remember, the attacker is on the move during an overrun. It's easier to ambush them. It's also easier to surprise the defender, right? Which is why the rule is structured the way it is. And in practice, it does, in fact, work. And in fact, works really well. And what it the net effect of what that mechanic does is to introduce uncertainty outside the range that one sees on the CRT, right? If you have, that it's going to take place in this column, then you can say, okay, well, I can roll it, here's the worst I can roll, here's the best I can roll, here's the possible range of results. But, there are definitely OCS games where neither side can hip shoot completely freely. I will tell you that in Blitzkrieg Legend, which is the thing we're playing right now, the Allies cannot hip shoot, and the Germans can only hip shoot with Ju-87s. I can't think of one where neither side can hip shoot, although thinking about it, Burma might be that game. I have not played Burma, however, so... I haven't played them all, so... There will be OCS games coming in a future Steel Wave as well, by the way. I had a 3-hour conversation about this earlier, so it is still in my mind. Jeff mentions that OCS's DAC compares well to Europa Western Desert, except that you cannot take Tripoli. Is it not on the map? I haven't set DAC up at... Well, I don't have DAC. I have DAC 2. So... Stigler, I won't say that that's wrong, to be honest. So I have a new chair. The previous chair, this is like an office chair. It's a Lazy Boy office chair that I got from Costco. This is the last one because the previous chair was literally killing me. It was killing my back and ass. The old chair got wheeled out to the curb earlier. All right. Panza mentions one of the more underrated tracking issues in OCS is keeping track of which multi-step units have lost steps and how much strength they currently have, not just supply. So that's true, but I have found that that's going to become second nature after a while. Whether that's a multi-step like division, where you're actually tracking the step losses with step loss markers, or whether that's a multi-unit formation and each one is its own counter. Now, the burden for that is eased somewhat by the multi-unit formation displays that are included in both Third Winter and Hungarian Rhapsody. This is one of the ways in which Curtis and company have really, really stepped it up in terms of player aids that reflect real player, actual play needs that in play, right? As opposed to, theoretical, we don't want to have off-map displays ideas. No, it was not that kind of chair. It was a cheap gaming chair that I bought, I think, through Amazon, and it lasted. It might have lasted a year. It was literally disintegrating under me. So, do not miss it. Now, the advantage of so I bought I walked out of Costco with, or wheeled out of Costco with the display model. It's got a couple of dings on it, but on the plus side, I didn't have to put it together. So. At some point, I will buy some kind of dream chair, but that day was not today. So now I, of course, have an astonishing and unique talent to roll Defender Surprise when I am attacking, even where the 16th Panzer Grenadier. Even when I'm at a +2 or sometimes even +3 AR advantage, it's uncanny. I had a couple about 2 weeks ago. I had a streak where I rolled 3 or less on the combat roll 4 times in a row, as the attacker in Blitzkrieg Legend. We're on about turn 3 or 4, and we are getting less than half a turn done in a 3 or 4 hour session. It is an interesting OCS game in that it's like a 2.5 map game. So it's not that big, but the density is relatively high. There's a lot of units. We're playing it with 3 people, which means that, fortunately, the fastest player is the French, and 2 of us are playing the Germans. And I'm really trying to take more time with my moves and make smart moves instead of doing stupid stuff. So, since I have the time, since the slowest player is my German colleague. So, some of those work chairs are like just are ridiculously expensive. Stigler, I saw that you came in contact with a copy of Time for Trumpets and half price. Well, you're gonna play it on Vassal, so you don't need to clip it at all. I'll tell you what, it's a huge, huge, huge project to clip that game. Mine's not fully clipped. I stopped. You'll recall that I like 4 counter clipping streams in a row. I was clipping Time for Trumpets, and I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something different. Craig Campbell asks, any plans for OCS to go to the Scandinavian front or to Yugoslavia, Greece, or Italy? There is an Italy game in development. I am not sure how far along it is. Balkans, I haven't heard anything, but that does not necessarily mean that there isn't anything. Do stay tuned for future interview with the OCS development team. That will be coming along in a couple of months. So, I mean, I clipped it, but, well, I didn't finish clipping it. That's the thing. I got sick of looking at it. There is, by the way, nothing of mine in this sale video that will launch on Wednesday. So, it is all friend stuff. Fifth Frontier War is really neat. I'm not convinced that it's actually fun to play as a game on its own, but it's really neat and can, of course, be used to drive a Traveller RPG campaign. So, honestly, so I mean, I'm a fan of IKEA for a lot of stuff, but chairs is not one of them. I'm a fat ass, and in every IKEA chair, well, not the living room chairs necessarily, but like the office chairs, they all feel incredibly rickety under me. So I am not doing that from IKEA. Costco, on the other hand, had this quite robust chair. It's actually a lazy boy, believe it or not. So if I appear to be shifting uncomfortably, this week it's because I'm accustoming myself to the new chair, and last week it was because I was struggling to not be miserable in the old chair. All right, it's counter tray time. Let's see what we have here. We have miscellaneous Axis miners. We've got to figure out what to do with those. Okay, so I think we're going to do SS Panzer Divisions. Oh, there's a lot. Okay. These are large formations. So the plan, sale-wise, is to do a video a month, which hopefully I'll be able to manage it in terms of workload. And right now, the immediate need is to get as much stuff out of my way as possible so that I can actually work in that space. Not work, but game work. You know, videos work. Because right now, that filming space is totally choked with friend stuff that I need to get rid of. These are big formations. We're going to have a bit of trouble getting them all into one compartment. I think I can do it, though. It's going to be tight, but I think I can do it. I will mention that both the local cadre of wargamers and the Winterfest group definitely have some Europa fans in them. So the chances of me playing Europa again at some point are quite high. I'm not in a rush, but because like I said, is like when we finished the second front game, I was like, man, I need to not play this for at least several years. But it's been a few years now, so I'm I'm thinking about getting back to it. I would like Todd to pitch Der Weltkrieg for our resuming Wednesday night campaign, in fact. So please do remind me of that when the time arrives. Since we both have, I think, everything in the series at this point. And we both like the series. And I think the other guys will like the series too. How adjustable is the new chair? I actually haven't tried to adjust it yet. I can lower it. That's good. And I can raise it, so that's good. Is there a... Yeah, there's another flap that allows me to recline pretty comfortably. Oh, that's actually really nice. I haven't used that yet, and then I can lock it in place. They're little flaps rather than the usual mechanical levers, which I don't really care for all that much. Alrighty, so... These are assault guns. Do I have more assault guns? No. Could put this in here. Oof. I almost sneezed, and I would probably have blown the mic up if I sneezed. So let's try not to do that. So we threw Tannenberg down on a table a couple years ago at a Buckeye Game Fest and really liked it. It is a very... So another thing that surprised me, especially considering the size of the game, is just how easy that game is to play. I mean, there's a lot to it in terms of you have to think through your movements and stuff, but the mechanics themselves are very straightforward. It is a very, very clean system. This is Der Weltkrieg. Very clean system. Alright, we're good for this for now. Where is the... There we go. Romanians go in the mixed forces tray. Oh, I'll tell you what. I mean, my dice... I suck at rolling dice. It's just a debacle on a weekly basis. So... I don't use the word robust that much, do I? I might, actually. I love that word. It's a good word. Normally, I mean, unless you're talking about something crazy like Campaign for North Africa, normally, even a big North Africa game is relatively manageable because there are not that many forces. And that's definitely true of DAC. I mean, it's not a small game, but it's certainly not the biggest... it's not the biggest North Africa game I've got, that's for sure. There's definitely more counters in, at least certainly counting units. There's more unit counters in War in the Desert. I'll tell you that. an open question as to how I'm going to organize certain things like transport and reserves and stuff like that. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that yet. What are these? These are breakdowns. God. Okay. Haven't even gotten to that yet. Jeff, I agree with that, but I feel like the entire treatment of, again, I think it's a scale problem. The treatment of armor in Europa is deeply flawed, and I think it's not that the mechanic is busted; it's that it's a scale problem. Are you going to have, in a 16-mile hex, one infantry regiment, for example? Probably no. I mean, I probably, well, maybe you do in certain scenarios, but should you just be able to roll over them with a big armor stack? But you're going to probably not put yourself in that situation because you are incentivized to maximize every stack every hex up to the limit that you can. Now, there are definitely certain scenarios in which you won't be able to do that because you don't have enough forces. But certainly in terms of Germans on the West Front, Allies on the West Front, either side on the East Front, well, maybe not the Soviets at first, but the Soviets will catch up to that, right? So Kyle Creeder mentions that they want you to cut up the maps for the campaign games. I agree with that, but I'm not convinced that you need to play the campaign games to get your money out of Der Weltkrieg either. I think that the modules, like the East Front module or the Ottoman module, I think those are more than big enough. I don't think you really realistically need to even try to play that campaign game. I know people have tried to do it. That's great. But John Longshore says, West Front of Der Weltkrieg to make huge army-destroying Verdun offensives. So are we saying that that is a thing that occurs? I have not played any of the West Front stuff, so I can't really comment on that. So it is my understanding that the West Front, at least for large portions of it, plays very much like the West Front did historically, where there's motion in the beginning, and then it locks up into deadlock for most of the rest of the war. That's my understanding, and that's historical. So in many respects, I suspect that the West Front volume, which has... So, from memory, I think the East Front game has 4 or 6 counter sheets. So it's a lot of counters, right? But that's like on like 8 maps. Or something like that, 6 maps maybe. The West Front game has just as many counters on 1 map. So the density of forces on that Western Front is insanely high. I mean, the number of modifiers in Europa was not something that bothered me. It was the way that you were forced to calculate some of those modifiers. Like, for example, the armor bonuses. It's just really clumsy. For an alternative way to handle it, look at, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the solution, but it's a solution. It's a lot easier to deal with. Look at the Mark Simonich operational games. Armor gives you a column shift. If you have certain types of defender in the hex, there's a column shift in the other direction. If you have like a troop quality differential, there's a column shift. But it's centered on 0, so most troops are 0s, right? And if you have elite troops, they might be like a +1. And if they're attacking like green troops that are a -1, they might get 2 column shifts. And there's also a cap on factors, but that's kind of a weird thing is a Mark Simonich thing. Todd, thanks for stopping by. We will see you soon. I have not played Reluctant Enemies. There might not be hip shoots there, actually. You're right, there's very little air in that game. I didn't even think of that one. I do. So at this point, I consider my OCS collection to be complete. And I say that because I either have every OCS game, or the OCS game in question is made obsolete by an OCS game that I have. So, Guderian's Blitzkrieg replaced by Guderian's Blitzkrieg 2. Enemy at the Gates replaced by Case Blue. Tunisia replaced by Tunisia 2. Hube's Pocket replaced by Third Winter. And I think I have everything after that. Sicily 1 was replaced by Sicily 2, but I think Sicily 1 and Sicily 2 are totally different games that Russo-Polish War might well work as an OCS game. The one I'm really curious to see... Okay, so there's two topics that are in development at some stage of development that I'm really curious to see if they can be successful OCS games. Those two topics are Normandy and the Italian campaign. The Italian campaign was very much a slog through garbage terrain, strongly held by a thin line of very good German troops. I think this system would handle it from a simulation standpoint. I'm not convinced it would be at all engaging to play. Be glad to be proven wrong. And we'll see on Normandy. That's actually in development. Well, let me put it this way. I've seen that. That's farther along. I think it's farther along than the Italy game is. I'm super interested in both. Well, you can't have mine, I'll tell you that. It's also punched, so. Sicily, so I've played both Sicily 1. I'm going to call it Sicily 1 because it's just easier, okay? When I say Sicily 1, I mean Sicily, Triumph, and Folly, the 2-map Sicily game. I am super interested in the Sicilian campaign, having a great-grandfather who got off the actual boat from actual Sicily, and a grandfather who has definitely acted like a Sicilian. Oops. So I'm super interested in the Sicilian campaign, and at one point I think I had 8 or 10 games on the topic. I got rid of 1 or 2 of them that I knew I wasn't going to like. But I've played both Sicily, Triumph and Folly, and Sicily 2, and I think they are both very good games that are good at showing you different things. I like the extra granularity that I get in Sicily, Triumph, and Folly, and I like the fact that you could play Sicily 2 in a long weekend, or even a long day, maybe. Ooh, that needs some more water. So we have actually seen Allied divisions as multi-unit formations in the past. We did so in Sicily, Triumph, and Folly, actually. I liked both games. Like I said, I had Sicily 2, and I've played it. And then I liked Sicily. I played Sicily, Triumph, and Folly, and I'm like, well, this is neat. It's quite different from the the smaller game. So I ran it down. I was very fortunate to score a copy at Compass Expo in the flea market, and I think I paid $30 or $40 for it. Now, that's a really good price. It was missing pieces, but it was not missing the pieces that I cared about. It had the maps and counters. I think that's all it had, is the maps and the unit counters. It was missing the rules and the charts and tables and the markers. But who cares? I have plenty of markers. Anzio definitely does not get off the peninsula, I can tell you that. But it's not necessary to cover getting off the peninsula, is it? It's only necessary to cover the struggle up the peninsula. Anzio does cover a chunk of it, but not the whole thing. And honestly, now I've only looked at an older edition of Anzio, so there's 4 editions of Anzio that Avalon Hill put out, and then I think fans have done a 5th edition. There's significant differences, I'm given to understand, between the 3rd and 4th editions of Anzio. I have the 3rd edition, I've only looked at that. So it's possible that the 4th edition is a vastly better game, and is worth playing. Based on my perusal of the 3rd edition, I do not believe it to be worth our time as a modern game. And in fact, if anyone would like a copy, it may be showing up. Actually, I can't really sell my copy of Anzio because it is missing counters. I bought it secondhand from a store that reshrink wraps stuff, and it was missing pieces. So it is at some point being given to somebody, or Oh, that's another thing that I forgot to mention. We are at 4,000 subscribers. We are over 4,000 subscribers, in fact. So, there is going to be a 4,000 subscriber giveaway next week. That video will basically be in the release slot that the sale video is in this week. So it will be released on Wednesday, and then it will go for a week or so before I do an actual drawing, and then the following week we'll do an actual drawing and start shipping things out. At this exact moment, I am planning on giving away 4 new or good as new war games. One of which, at least, is courtesy of Compass Games, and we'll see what the other ones are. I haven't made up my mind on all of them yet. But there are going to be 4, and to symbolize the thousands of subscribers. So I would like to thank everyone who is subscribed. Encourage you to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. If you're here tonight and you're not subscribed, then what's going on? I don't understand. Because you're already signed up for all the stuff. Google is already tracking you and knows everything about you. So I was a little paranoid when I was watching the number. I'm like, well, it's a 4,000. What if somebody quits and unsubscribes right now? Then I'll be at $39.99, and then I'll have announced it and look like an asshole. And I didn't want to do that. Salerno to Rome actually does look good. Unfortunately, it's a European release, and it's hard to get in this country. OCS contemplate theoretical scenarios. Yes, but only in the context of the titles that they've done. So many of the games do contain hypothetical scenarios, but they're like, a Guderian's Blitzkrieg hypothetical scenario where the Germans continue to drive toward Moscow rather than diverting tons of forces south. That's the kind of historical situation we are talking about, and that suits the operational scale of OCS. That's kind of the problem with Europa, actually, is that it's an operational game that's trying way too hard to be a strategic game. And at 16 miles to the hex, maybe it should be a strategic game. Probably not. But it is confused as to where it wants to place its emphases. I have not seen Just a Guard here tonight. I might have missed him too. That's possible. I mean, I have 3 different YouTube accounts. So, is it 4? No, well, it's technically 2 accounts, actually. There are 2 channels on this account. But it's 1 account. Oh, Jeff, I disagree. And in fact, I refused to deal with the naval system because it is ridiculously baroque. But I think what we were trying to do, and I'm not sure because I resolutely ignored it, is I think we were trying to retrofit the Wavell's War naval system into Second Front. I will say this. We got a historical-looking result. We made historical-looking mistakes. There were historical-looking fiascos. The aggregate result we got out of Second Front had very good historicity. It wasn't exactly like World War II. We did a lot of different things. We tried to invade southern France way ahead of schedule, for example. That didn't really go well. We got pinned down on the coast. But that was because that was dumb. We also actually had at least one disastrously bad amphibious assault, so that hurt too. But it came down to a points victory for the Germans in the last turn. So, and it is of some value to be able to say, yes, we played that son of a bitch till the very end, beginning to bitter end. Boy, I was tired of it. Holy cow. I am hugely focused toward operational games now, which is very interesting because formerly in my former wargaming life, that was kind of a blind spot of mine. And now it is very much, I mean, I still do strategic games and tactical games and other stuff, but for me now, operational is where it's at. And I find myself bemoaning the lack of operational choices on a lot of topics like Ancients. Not many operational Ancients games. There's not really that many operational Civil War games, but fortunately the ones we do have are really, really good. So I am satisfied with that. The Solo Wargaming Show. First of all, welcome to the stream. What kind of store reshrinks stuff missing pieces? It is called the Soldiery, and it is in Columbus, Ohio. That's who does. I think they're upfront about that they reshrink wrap stuff, and I think they make noise about taking returns if you have problems. But I did not pursue that, so I don't want to give them too much grief about it. It was not expensive, particularly. A beat up old copy of the ugly Mussolini box Anzio. So OCS, did we take Berlin? No, we did not. But they didn't historically either. We did cross the Rhine. We were well across the Rhine, brutally bashing our way in. But we didn't reduce. And again, the game ends in May of 45. So we did not force a German surrender by that point through the Western Front. And I think that's the timetable, is when the Soviets, they take Berlin in May of 45. So that's the end of the game. So that's another thing. Panzer, OCS Crimea is in development. There were a couple of different efforts going toward an OCS Crimea game, and I think the current thinking is that it is going to be both a standalone playable thing, and you'll be able to tack it onto the bottom of Third Winter, where the map fits rather nicely. The map is not identical to the Crimea map in Case Blue, but the differences are mostly just a slightly different map orientation, as opposed to big map changes. It's a more interesting situation than I think people would normally assume, Crimea. It is actually a fairly interesting campaign. It starts, first of all, with the Germans having no armor assets of any kind. And a bunch of their other stuff has just been pulled away to deal with other problems. So it is a fairly... The Germans have to start this operation to take Crimea with this, really on this kind of shoestring operation. I will point out that I do have Barbarossa Crimea, so the reason I know a little bit about how the campaign goes is because I've had a little bit of a crack at trying to play that. That is, in fact, the game that is under all that stuff upstairs. So, I don't want to be... I am kind of an unreserved booster of OCS, but I don't want to mislead people into thinking they're going to love it when there's a lot of idiosyncrasies to OCS. It is very, as we say, fiddly. I think it's hilarious when the local OCS guys talk about other games being fiddly, and I'm like, man, this is noticeably less fiddly than OCS is. Okay. Oops. You are keeping track of supply on the map. Honestly, that's something that... So, one of the things... Okay, first of all, Europa does this too. The number of points and the things you spend on is just not as much. So there's that. So let's not pretend that Europa doesn't do that. So if we're maintaining our discussion about... I'm trying to revolve the discussion around Europa versus OCS, right? There we go. So the tracking of supply points does get to be sort of second nature after a while. It's not really that much trouble once you've gotten used to it. There is a learning curve. There is a handling curve where you kind of get your fingers, if you will, in the routine. And a lot of things like the way supply gets spent is fiddly, right? We say fiddly. So for the attacker, you have to spend combat supply when you do combat. For the attacker, combat supply is one token per step. For the defender, combat supply is 2 tokens for the entire combat, unless there is only one are less, I think, less than 1 RE involved in, or maybe it's even 1 RE or less involved in the combat, in which case it is only 1 T. But you can choose to go on no supply if you want and be halved, or if you are cut off from supply, you can go on internal stocks and go to low stocks. But you can't do that if you could draw the supply. So it's super fiddly. It's less accountanty than it sounds, but I won't pretend that it isn't a little accountanty. The thing that, about artillery being very expensive to shoot is a bit... I won't pretend that that's not a thing, but it is usually overstated. An experienced OCS player will have an idea of when it is worth firing the artillery, because you are more likely to do step losses with artillery than you are with air. Because you do step losses if you assume you hit the kicker die. You do step losses on a bracketed 1/2, where you don't if it's air. So all right, so we have finished. I did start clipping a little bit before the stream started, so 2 counter sheets this evening, and we are 1 hour and 20 minutes in. So let's see what we have. I have... Let's be careful. All right, so we got this sheet, which has much of miscellaneous stuff, and we have this sheet, which has... And these are markers, which has not too much stuff. Well, what do we start with? Let's continue with Germans. Okay, so Block Oddity. Yeah, I did pick up 4X. I picked up 4X and This Guilty Land from Hollenspiel. This Guilty Land looks like it's going to be hard to play, if you know what I'm saying. And 4X looks like interesting to me, right? It's probably not something I'll play all the time, but I definitely want to try it. It's like literally the most expensive game Hollenspiel makes, too, because it's got a lot of components, comparatively speaking. OCS Sea Lion would be good, but it would be interesting, I guess. I don't know. I mean, it would be cool, but the people sort of making the calls behind the series have never greenlit like a strictly hypothetical game, and that's what you would need for Sea Lion. All right, so all right, Craig Campbell asks, how does EFS fit in with OCS in Europa? Okay, so that's actually an interesting question. And I think that's probably worth its own episode, actually. But at a high level, the EFS is the Vance von Borries East Front system from GMT. And it consists of, at the moment, 5 games. The progenitor of the series is a game called Typhoon, about Typhoon. And then you have Barbarossa Army Group South, Barbarossa Army Group Center, Barbarossa Army Group North, and then Barbarossa Kiev to Rostov, which kind of picks up where Army Group South leaves off, and then Barbarossa Crimea, which tacks on to the bottom of, I forget whether it's Army Group South or Kiev to Rostov, but one of the two. And I think the idea nominally at one point was to do the whole East Front at this scale, but honestly, I don't believe that that's ever going to happen. We are going to see, however, a new Army Group Center. Okay, so I have given no thought to comparing EFS to Europa, but I can compare it to OCS because that's a comparison that gets made. The two game systems are very different. The scale is very similar. The unit scale is higher in EFS. There are less units. And what that means in practice is that more of the units in EFS are like whole divisions, as opposed to components of divisions, as they often are in OCS, particularly if they're armored divisions or mech cores or something like that. The sequence of play in EFS is asymmetric. So the Germans, there's a German turn and a Soviet turn. The German phases happen in a different order than the Soviet phases. So the Germans have advantages that derive from that. The Soviets have headquarters units, which the Germans do not. So the Germans, so the headquarters are both good for the Soviets in that they have capabilities that they can trigger, and they're bad for the Soviets in that there are penalties if they get penalized. So if they get like shot up. So am I fitting all of this air in one compartment? Probably not. So also another key component, and I'm aware that there have been at least half-hearted efforts to do a Barbarossa OCS, by which we mean OCS on the East Front that starts on June 22nd, 1941, right? The trouble with this is, and there's a reason why we've never seen that, and the trouble with it is it's a shitty game for the Soviets. It is many months of getting kicked in the teeth before you have the chance to do anything. Anything remotely enjoyable, right? Which is why even there are games that take place after that, right? Smolensk takes place after that, which is, but that is a situation that was very specifically chosen because it is the place in which the Germans met their first serious check in that campaign, right? And that's in July, I believe it starts in July of 41, and it's in that, that one central sector. Guderian's Blitzkrieg 2 takes place after that initial rush, right? I think it starts in September. I might be misremembering this. As I recall, it starts around September of 41 and then runs through about January or February. So it includes, the Operation Typhoon, the big drive on Moscow, but it also includes massive Soviet counteroffensives. Smolensk doesn't have a massive Soviet counteroffensive, but there will be a Soviet counteroffensive in there. So it's a good situation to play. On the other hand, I think that if you try to blow that up and cover the whole front, I think you end up with a very unenjoyable game for the Soviet player. I don't think that's necessarily less true for EFS than it is for OCS. However, I do think that EFS is a very good solitaire game. And you're more focused as the Soviets on stopping the Germans rather than necessarily on making counterattacks. All right. So, all right. Stigler says, doesn't want the supply, don't get the supply. Jive ass turkey ain't got no sense anyhow. Okay. I'm not sure. Maybe I lost track of what we were talking about there. Also, later games. That's true, Gordon. That's true. There are a lot of the later, not all, but a lot of the later games do give you like free barrage chits in some capacity, and that's a thing. Another thing that John Longshore points out is that the Barbarossa Army Group Center is, I believe, 4 maps and 4 counter sheets, or 3 counter sheets, or 3.5 counter sheets. Large game, a bunch of booklets, tons of player aids. It's still like $55 or $59, and I don't know why, and I hate to say this, but maybe you want to pre-order that if you're at all interested in it, because it's not going to last forever. It'll eventually be out of print and will go for a bunch of money again. And right now, that price is a crazy price. And I have to think it's because the thing went on P500 like 10 years ago, and the price was never adjusted upward. I mean, I don't know that, but that's what it feels like. So that's why I didn't buy Army Group Center when I was collecting the series a few months ago, because I haven't really seen a copy for less than about $150, and I didn't pay anything remotely like that for any of the other ones, and I wasn't about to pay it for Army Group Center, especially since I knew it was the first one that was going to get reprinted, and it's going to the printer this month supposedly. I disagree with you on Smolensk. I think this now you do get kicked around, but Smolensk is not a super long game either. You could play it in a month of weekly 3 hour sessions. It's not. You could play it in one sitting, one long sitting. Let me put it that way. You will get the chance to strike back as the Soviets, but your main objective is to stop the Germans from taking all the objectives, right? So if you can do that, then it doesn't really matter that you got a counterattack in. There are definitely movement restrictions in the beginning of the game. They're low AR units. That's to be blunt, that is a factor in many of the OCS games that happen on the East Front. You are always at an AR disadvantage, and considering how early in the war, the East Front war, that game is, I think the AR of the Soviet units makes sense. And in our game, the Soviets won. Came down to the very last turn. The Soviets won because the Germans just couldn't take the last victory city. Blockaddy says he has all three of Hollenspiel's political arm wrestling games, but this Guilty Land is the most unselling to play through. Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that. Optimates et Populares is easier because it is ancient and more comic satire. That makes sense, actually. I hadn't really thought of it in that context. That's easier. All right, Block Oddity, thanks for stopping by. If we don't catch you on the way back, I think we are getting all this air into one compartment. And there is, the Soviets do have some punching power. The trick is to try and pull back in an orderly way such that the Germans pocket as little as possible. Jeff Beeler says OCS Soviets and French need careful planning as they are only really strong attacking in the combat phase. So that's true. As this is generally true. But it becomes less true the farther into the war you get. You are usually at an AR disadvantage as the Soviet player, okay? And you just have to suck that up. I mean, you are going to be attacking at a lower AR most of the time. Now, there are things that you could do to mitigate that, right? One is pick a game that's later in the war, where the Soviet AR disadvantage is less. It's still there, but it's less. So in a game like Third Winter, say, the average German AR is probably a 4 or 3.9 or something like that. Average Soviet AR is probably more like a 3.5. But the Soviets got some 4s and 5s in Third Winter, which is, I'm pretty sure there's no 5s in Smolensk, for example. There might be a 4 or 2. But there are things that can be done to mitigate that with good play. So one thing you can do is to, have an attack that you are doing, and you barrage the hex that you're attacking first to disorganize it. That's a thing you can do. Now, what Jeff's getting at is that normally there's some of the late games have exceptions to this. So in Hungarian Rhapsody, some of the Soviet air, I think Soviet Guards air can do hip shoots. It's infrequent to be able to get hip shoots as the Soviet player, except in Third Winter and in Hungarian Rhapsody, and maybe in Baltic Gap, although I'm not sure about that. Don't quote me on that. These all run together at some point, right? So your ability to hip shoot makes a huge difference in terms of your ability to get DG to do overruns in the movement phase, right? Also, if you are at an AR disadvantage, you are more likely to get defender surprised if you attack as an overrun because the range is bigger. If you roll a 5 or less on the surprise roll in the combat phase, it's defender surprise. And if you roll a 6 or less as the attacker in the movement phase on an overrun, you get defender surprised. That one doesn't sound like a lot, but if you look at the 36 possible results on a 2d6, it's significant. It's significant. Gordon says there's no Soviet hip shoots in Third Winter. I haven't looked at that yet. Jeff, that would bust the game. Now, the other thing So we're playing Blitzkrieg Legend right now, right? And you do have to be careful with the French. And for the same reason, it's actually worse than it is with the Soviets, because unlike the Soviets in most games, the Allied units in move mode are at one less AR. I'm pretty sure they're all like that. And if they're not all like that, the vast majority of them are like that. So if you're going to do overruns, then you're going to be looking at 1-hex infantry overruns, or you're going to be looking at overruns at a significant AR disadvantage. That's not something you want to do. And you don't get hip shoots. What you do have as the French player is a lot of artillery. And, you know, it seems expensive to, you know, fuel that artillery. But you can paralyze an enemy. And we've seen this happen in 2 consecutive Blitzkrieg Legend games now, where the Germans cross the Meuse. French artillery catches up to them. They don't get a double turn, so they can't force their way into the open terrain beyond the Ardennes. And French artillery pounds them and keeps them DG'd basically every turn. The French have tons of artillery, and after the first turn, they have a fair number of reserve markers to use with them. And they don't get that much supply, but they don't really have to. They don't really have to spend a ton fueling armored formations either, which the Germans do. So Alan Salazar, thanks for stopping by, if I haven't missed you already. So the hip shoot is basically, I can tell you how it works. What is it intended to represent? It is intended to represent a greater facility of your air to provide combat air support. That's what it really means. Okay? What it means is that ordinarily the movement phase is composed of a breakout segment, a movement segment, and a barrage segment. The difference in the hip shoot is that you can do the hip shoot in the movement segment and not have to wait for the barrage segment. So what you can do is you can move a unit to get spotting. You can do a hip shoot, and you can keep hip shooting. Unlike other types of barrages, you can keep rolling as long as you have aircraft to do it with, or until you run out of patience. Until you get the DG result you're looking for, and then you can resume moving with other units. Okay? So, where am I at here? I guess we're going in this bin. So what you use that for in practice is where you, especially, you can use it for other things too, but what I typically use them for is for overruns, where it's like, okay, I want to overrun this unit, so I'll run something up there adjacent to it if I need to get spotting on it, and then I will hip shoot it till I DG it, which sometimes takes me 5 times, because hip shoots are always done with a single aircraft. Where's the Germans? There we are. So you're only getting, in Blitzkrieg Legend, it's 12 factors, which is not a great roll. And if the terrain is crappy, and it is, if you're in the Ardennes, which is largely wooded rough, which is a -1 column shift. Often sometimes there'll be a density column shift as well, out not in your favor. So the term is a Dean, what we'll call a Deanism. It's one of those terms that Dean likes to use because it felt right at the table, and doesn't really have a historical basis. Sometimes the Dean terminology is like that, and sometimes it's not. Like the snafu roll. Snafu is actually a thing that people said in World War II, right? So, because of the AR thing with the French in Blitzkrieg Legend, it is a very good idea to not put the French in move mode unless you can avoid it. I will clue you in. You cannot always avoid it. Sometimes you just have to put them in movement mode. Sometimes it's because you're strat moving them and they have to be in move mode. But then hopefully they're not going to get caught pants down with getting attacked if they're in strat mode, because then they're 0 combat strength anyway. So. John, I would like to see actually more on the French advances in because the French did some attacks into German territory in 1939, and I think those would have to be kind of tactical or grand tactical type of games. But I'd like to actually see more coverage of that. That is the thing that happened. They didn't make a huge amount of progress, but nor did they hang on to anything. Sokoff. So Sokoff is I mean, I've heard people use the term. I'm not sure I've seen a game use the term. I've heard it used in the context of the kind of mandatory attacks that you are required to do to conduct other attacks in game systems like EFS and the Battle for Normandy. It is not a mechanism that I favor. I have put up with it in a couple of different games, including both of those. So I do think it works pretty well in the Battle for Normandy because you can do it with artillery barrages. At least for the Allies, you can do well. You do it with the Germans too, but you have to spend the supply points to do the artillery barrages as the Allies. Did they? Because I don't remember that, which doesn't mean you're wrong. I'm just saying I don't remember that. Well, I mean, the term DG is short for disorganized. So, I mean, that you're making the term disorganized, that's not a piece of terminology that bothers me. But it's also not an attempt to be cute, where the term hip shoot kind of is an attempt to be cute. And that is something that that Dean has done in the past for various things. There are cases in which it works well. One example where I think it works very well is in the Line of Battle series, where there is a status, a sort of shaken status called Cowardly Legs. But that's like, a thing that was said back then. So it's a flavor thing and it works. Other things like crossing the streams, right? What's crossing the streams a reference to? It's a Ghostbusters reference, man. It doesn't mean anything in the context of history. And that's a BCS term, right? So sometimes, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. What do you mean it's not short for disorganized? It's totally short. In the context of the OCS, it's short for disorganized. So, now, one might say that the effects of the mechanic are not doing what they should be. But that's a different. I think that's a different statement, and I would address that differently. John Longshore, I will tell you, I've played War in Europe. We didn't do that, but it's full of holes. To be honest, it's really full of holes. So. And I say that with fondness. It's full of holes, but it's also a huge game that remains highly playable despite being a huge game, and that's something that is interesting. I think there's a lot to recommend to BCS. By the way, there's also some things I don't like about it, but there's a lot to recommend BCS, and I look forward to more BCS games on topics that I am interested in. I mean. Okay, so if I don't know how bothered I am with the term hip shoot. I mean, I've kind of internalized the topic at this point. Okay, I think Stigler, I think I see what you're trying to say. You're not wrong, but I also don't know that I would paint carry a picket sign on this particular topic. Jeff asked if Blitzkrieg Legend is a free deployment scenario for the Allies. I don't think it does. I know we're not playing with it. Boy, that would make the setup a lot faster. I'll tell you that. Well, maybe. I mean, the other thing is that I'll tell you what. I mean, okay. So, in many cases, free deployment scenarios break games. Okay, there are many, many, many examples of that where that happens. One example that I can think of is one from recent personal experience. So, Winterfest 2020. Yeah, Winterfest 2020, when we had the two big games of GTS Market Garden going. Now, my game is not the game this happened in, so it's just sort of secondhand experience, but I got to see it happening. We played pretty much by the book. The other table played some kind of free drop variant where the Allied airborne divisions could just drop wherever they wanted. And what ended up happening was, of course, the British 1st Airborne dropped right outside of Arnhem, so they just walked the entire division right into the city. That busted that game. That flatly blew that game to pieces. It became... I mean, they played all week, so they didn't have a miserable time, but I know there were some people that were frustrated with that. So it depends. I mean, there's a number of factors, and I certainly will not say that a free setup will bust every game every time, because that's not true. But you got to be real careful with free setup scenarios. On the other hand, look at something like World in Flames, which is always free setup, right? So you can set that stuff up wherever you want, and I think World of War is too, for that matter. So there's a lot of factors there. On the other hand, there's definitely optimal and suboptimal setups too. So Jeff, that's a good way to think of hip shoots. Is on call. You can call them in at any moment. On the other hand, we don't. We do in Beyond the Rhine. The Allies can hip shoot, and I think the Germans can as well, for that matter. One thing that we noticed, as much of a slog as it was to play through it, we did absolutely see in Second Front the slow, over the course of 2 turns a month, erosion. Not that slow, but not in, what didn't happen over the course of 2 turns either. Erosion of Axis air capability, until the end, where they didn't have the ability to do much except serve as a guerrilla air force. So even though the whole thing was a big kind of pain in the shorts to actually play through it, we did, as in many other respects, at the end of the game, really before the end of the game in this particular case, we did get a solidly historical feeling result. And that's not nothing. All right. Stigler says MMP games have no subtlety in design, so they are probably incapable of designing a well-done disorganization counter. I don't agree with... I mean, we can quibble about the whether the acronym is appropriate or not, but I believe that to be a point that is not something I'm willing to get into a spirited argument about. Let me put it that way. And I think there's a lot of subtlety in the design of OCS specifically, and that's also true of Line of Battle. And I'm going to end up naming all the gamers' games that I'm familiar with. So one thing that I've drawn this division before, and I think it's important, is that there is a difference between stuff that's produced by the gamers, which kind of exists as this sort of semi-autonomous unit within MMP, and stuff that's produced by the rest of MMP, right? MMP is a bit weird in that they feel like they operate as these silos, where here's the ASL silo, and here's the GCACW silo, and here's the gamers silo, and here's the international silo. And the gamers are not really doing the gamers stuff. And bear in mind, like, GTS is not the gamers. GTS is its own little tiny silo. but but GTS was built on kind of the gamer's model, right? Where you have a series and you have series rules and that kind of thing. The way the development happens and the way things pass to the parent company is different depending on which part of MMP you are talking about. There is a noticeable difference between, for example, this is where it's, I think, most obvious, between the gamers stuff and the international series stuff. And that's not a statement that says one is better than the other. That is a statement that says there are people that like the gamer's art style and they would hate the international game series art style, which is much less unified anyway. And there are people who hate the international series games. They think they're ugly, and they love the gamer's style. I think I said that twice. So, and those games they pass through the development process very differently. The gamers stuff has always been very carefully developed. I don't want to say that no dog has ever slipped through, because I don't think that's the case. But generally speaking, on the gamers side, the development has been very careful. There are relatively few, at least in recent memory, there are relatively few, possibly zero in recent memory, flatly busted things that have made it through that pipeline. Again, and I can name a flatly busted thing that came through the ASL pipeline. Hakapalo, the Finnish module, flatly busted. Finns are vastly overpowered. The international series, War of the Suns, not a well-regarded game. So it really does depend what part of MMP we're talking about. And I'm not really sure who kind of runs that international series thing. And remember that the game series, there's so much subtlety in GCACW, but I would say the same, that, as far as that statement goes, I'd say the same thing with OCS. We've spent I could spend a whole session, and I guess I did, bitching about MMP, and now I've spent most of what feels like a stream pretty much having nothing but, not nothing but good things, but mostly positive stuff to say about them. And a lot of that is, my general happiness with OCS. Not to say there's no problems, not to say there's nothing that I ever find frustrating, because there is. And I should probably do a show about that, actually. We could start with the tank busters in Hungarian Rhapsody, for example. Ken, I don't agree with that, actually. Except maybe the counters. I'm really pleased with GCACW under MMP, actually. I think they're doing a really wonderful job. Now, they did... I don't like the new style counters, that they're not the new style counters anymore, that they did with the first version of Stonewall Jackson's Way 2 and Battle Over the Clouds. I think the older counters are the older unit counters are much clearer. Now they fixed that because people complained about. I found those counters very visually confusing. They fixed that in Rose to Gettysburg 2 and these are not breakdowns. Some of these are not breakdowns. Put these in a separate pile. We're going to be done clipping after we clip the ones that are in my hand here. So Stigler, I think that's the magic in GCACW. Remember, the roll's eventually going to come up for it. It's really just a matter of how long it's going to take. That is the magic of GCACW. So that is exactly what I like about it. That's not to say that it is not absurdly frustrating when you keep losing initiative roll after initiative roll after initiative roll, even where you win ties, because that's happened. I did that to Pat in the Chattanooga or Chickamauga campaign. So half-ass gaming on the artwork, except for Kibler. Charlie is one of the great wargame artists working today. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I know that when we talk about, and again, there's a wide variety of product coming out of. Well, I don't know about wide variety of product, but there's a number of different art styles that come out of MMP. Okay, there's the Dean Essig house style, which is almost all the gamers stuff. Okay, Line of Battle has Dean maps, OCS has Dean maps, most SCS games, but not all, have Dean maps. And that is a somewhat idiosyncratic style that a lot of people don't think is attractive looking. I don't know that I think it's gorgeous, but I do think it's, generally speaking, very clear. The exception to that would be the Line of Battle maps, which has 117 different levels of elevation, which I think is both unnecessary and visually confusing. So there's that. But then if you look at the GTS art style, which is the Nickascooby art style, it's completely different, and I think it's super duper attractive. Now I'm talking about maps, right? Counters are a different, same idea, right? But I'm gonna say these are the pretty ones are in different games in some cases. I really like those Nickascooby GTS maps, for example. Then you have the Charlie Kibler maps in GCAZW, and as I've said in many times, I think those are the best looking maps in wargaming ever. I don't think. I mean, it's subjective to some extent. I'll certainly agree with that, but I don't think for me it's a contest. I think they're the best looking maps ever, and I said that back when they came out. I hadn't even played the damn things yet. So I'm like, well, I don't know what to make of this thing, but boy, the map's pretty. And they're actually pretty easy to play on as well. So there's that. Counters, I will cop to not necessarily being a fan of the gamers style counters in a lot of ways. There's a number of reasons for that. One is a lot of the ID stripes that... So in like the first two BCS games, there were no color ID stripes on the formations. That's a terrible design decision. They fixed that in Brazen Chariots, but it took 2 games to do that, and I find that a bit baffling. Sometimes there'll be multiple formations that have counter, and I have very good color vision, and sometimes I can't make the differences out between like this blue and that blue colored stripe. They could do a better job at that. Some of the typefacing on the gamers counters, not all, and lately it's been pretty solid, is hard to read. Like some of the counters in DAC 2, I think it's DAC 2, are not that easy to read. So there's that. Some of the color choices, like, I think it's, It Never Snows has one of the formations. I think the British 1st Airborne is in kind of a hideous pink. That's a bizarre choice that I don't think... I mean, they're the Red Devils. Why aren't they red? Why are they pink? I don't know why they're pink. They're not the Pink Devils, right? So, weird color choices. The GTS counters, I think, are generally good. I think they also make... So GTS made the decision to use the period-appropriate symbology. You may be aware that the Allied World War II unit symbology is mostly similar to the current NATO symbol set, but not identical. In particular, the symbols for every kind of artillery are all different. The German symbols will largely be completely unfamiliar unless you've managed to find one of the relatively few games that uses that symbol set. Make sure I don't mix these up here. But the fact is that the symbol on the counters in GTS is irrelevant. What you are really looking for is the movement type and the fire type. Those tell you everything you need to know about how the unit behaves. The International Series counters, I haven't seen that many of them. I mean, they look fine. The couple of maps I've seen from the International Series look pretty good as well. SCS counters and OCS counters are the same style counters. I'm not a huge fan of the Line of Battle counters. I will say that Nate from Wise Guy History pointed this out too. I find the great battles of the American Civil War counters to be 100% superior in every respect to the line of battle counters. I mean, they're not 100% the same in terms of comparability, but I think that the information is more clearly presented on the GBACW counters. And I like line of battle a lot, don't get me wrong, but that's one thing where I think GBACW has a clear advantage over it. They do have the white hex grids. The GTS games have the Caltrop hex grid. Some people hate that. That doesn't really bother me. I'm much more concerned about whether the hex grid is clear, and I can see where the hexes are. That's much bigger a concern than whether the hex grid, the hex lines themselves are white or black or purple or whatever. Victory Roads is a very attractive game. That's a Hexasim game, though. That's like almost cheating, to be honest. All of the Hexasim games that I've seen anyway are extremely attractive. You may get to see a Napoleon Against Europe piece of content from me at some point now. So, but the Soviet units in SCS are normally not red; they're normally brown. And that's fine because the uniforms were brown, right? But if they want to have red guards or whatever, that's fine. In OCS, I don't mind this. I'm not getting bent out of shape over it, but it's weird, right? The guards are like a light tan, or the regular Soviet troops are like a light tan, and the guards are a weird orange. That's a weird choice. And it is just it's a Dean thing, right? I know Ty. Ty's a great guy. So I have nothing but positive things to say about Ty. Ty was one of the guys in our GTS game in last year, and he is the guy. He's the guy that lost the San Bridge, I believe. He had a really bad stroke of luck, too, though, so... we will be done in 6 more counters is where we are. So, all right. Now, I guess I'll put them back in the tray, too. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to make the statement that MMP maps or counters or boxes or whatever are, in general, the prettiest anywhere. But I don't think that they're distractingly hideous, and part of that is just you being used to them. That's certainly a thing. And I do think the more recent boxes are attractive. I really like the Third Winter box, for example. It looks very similar to the Hungarian Rhapsody box. And if you look at the North Africa box, it's kind of a similar look. So that's a box I like too. We did mention GBACW, but remember, GBACW and GCACW are 2 different things. So, people objected to the GCACW counters in Stonewall Jackson's Way 2 and Battle Above the Clouds. Both great games, by the way. The other thing is that, and this is something that comes up from time to time, and maybe we could circle back to this in a future episode, is that MMP games can seem expensive if you just do a components list, right? And I won't argue with that. Sometimes that's, they do seem expensive. But at the same time, at least if we are talking about GTS, OCS, and GCACW, the games tend to be relatively expensive. I mean, MSRP on Third Winter is $200. Nevertheless, it is... I will not end up having a problem with that because I will get more than $200 of play value out of Third Winter. Just like I got more than I've already gotten more than $200 or whatever. Well, I think it's $160 for Roads to Gettysburg 2. So at least for those 3 series, I don't know that I'm going to try to make a larger statement about other gamers or MMP series, but at least those series, the games can be expensive, but I have always felt like they have offered good value at the end of the day when you do the rest of the equation. That's the value you got out of the box as opposed to just what the box cost in the first place. The GCACW games are have enormous play value. The scenarios are all incredibly solid. There are a lot less scenarios in the OCS stuff, but they're all, we play twice a week. So I'm personally going to get plenty of value out of those games, and I have no problem with that. And anybody that wants to get into OCS, there's no shortage of opponents, even if you've got to go to Content World Expo to play. So, all right, let's try and catch up on the chat at the very last minute. I feel Rick Barber, the late great Rick Barber, great artist. Sometimes his maps were hard to read. Sometimes, not all the time. The use of pink on the counters is just weird. I mean, you get a pass to Avalon Hill in 1958, right? But MMP in 2015 is just a weird choice. Maps and counters. The entire Jaws of Victory package is gorgeous. A game that is, as far as I'm aware, last I checked, which was a couple weeks ago, still available. Favorite OCS and Europa games. My favorite OCS game is Baltic Gap right now. I have a feeling that if you ask me in a year or two, it's going to be third winner. That's my gut feeling on that. Your favorite Europa game is the one that I'm not playing at the moment. So, prettiest game in all creation is Clash of Arms Triumph of Chaos, 2nd edition. It is a very attractive game. It is rife with errata. It is an errata typhoon. The amount of errata in that thing is a absolute disgrace. And I mean, it really makes it a big. It really disincentivizes me trying to play it. It looks like a great game too. I don't mind teal so much. Lurid pink is a different story. So, all right. So we are overtime actually, but that is okay. Okay. So here's what's going on. Tomorrow, sale video goes live at 5 p.m. Eastern for patrons only. It goes up as an unlisted video. Link on the Patreon feed. So check that out. Instructions are all in the video. Gets pulled down Wednesday at 5 p.m., goes back up as a premiere at 8 p.m. 9 p.m. I said 9 p.m. And then we'll be doing live. I'll be monitoring it live and all that for whatever's left. Most of it will probably be, I don't know. I don't know how it's going to work. We're going to see. So not too late to get in. Not to if you want to game the system, go ahead. It's not too late to become a Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's also a Ko-Fi link if you want to throw me $5 or $10 or, Scotch is expensive, so feel free to be generous. On Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we will be streaming with Dan Pancaldi of No Enemies Here on No Enemies Here. So it's not going to be here this week. It's going to be over on Dan's channel, and our subject is war movies. Possibly first in a war movie marathon, because as I keep telling Dan, I could talk about A Bridge Too Far for an hour. So we may need to do episode 2 on that just to get to a second movie, as far as I'm concerned. So back to A Bridge Too Far. We could talk about the soundtrack for 20 minutes, actually. So, and then on Thursday, there will be an unboxing video. I haven't actually done it yet. I mean, the video's filmed, but there's a pile of videos in the folder. Let me put it that way. So I think it's going to be Atlantic Chase. We'll see if that actually pans out, or if something else shows up in the meantime that I have to rush into production. That could happen. And then next Monday, we will be back here. We are looking at resuming our, what used to be a Wednesday session, which is going to become a Tuesday session, I guess. That is the local group that died temporarily with the pandemic. I'm very much looking forward to that resuming, because we get to rotate through different games, and it's not just OCS 100% of the time. So, so stay tuned to the channel and subscribe and all that blah, 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 blah. And we'll be back next week. So thanks everybody for watching. Everybody have a great and safe night. Happy 4th of July. I am pleased to report that I didn't have to complain about them playing the 1812 Overture over fireworks this year, so that's a plus. I actually could have gone on that, because they played Chariots of Fire over the fireworks, which is like, what? Why are they playing this? It's about British people. So weird choice, but anyway. So great. Have a great night, everybody, and we'll